I'm George Curtis. Welcome to It's Your Environment. Each week it's my privilege to bring guests that teach all of us about the environment and why it makes a difference. I think we're starting to recognize how important the environment is, and that it isn't just our backyard that's the environment. What happens to the air quality in industrial Michigan, where our guest today hails from, or the pollution in India, or the fires burning the forests of South America and Central America in order to plant crops. We all use the same air, and eventually it's all the same environment. Today's guest is my son Eric, a retired PhD engineer with Ford, and he makes me jealous every time I talk to him because he loves to travel. Well, I love to travel too. The difference is he does it. And that's a big difference. One of his favorite trips that brought back some spectacular photography that we're going to share with you is to New Zealand. If you don't know where New Zealand is, join the club. I had to look at a map and a globe and figure out where they put such a beautiful place and made it so hard to get to. But I'll ask Eric more about that. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Where is this New Zealand, and what do you have to do to get there?
Well, New Zealand is about 1,200 miles southeast of Australia, which is probably the closest reference I can come up with. When we flew there, we flew and stopped in Fiji, and then jumped on changed planes, and then flew on to New Zealand, Christchurch in New Zealand. So it's a little bit in the middle of nowhere, and that's maybe some explanation of why it's so pristine and beautiful to this day.
How long a trip by plane from the Midwest here?
Well, let me think. So my recollection is you first fly to Los Angeles, which is going to be 4 or 5 hours, something like that. Then I think you flew to Fiji, which was probably another 8 hours, and then down to New Zealand, which was probably another 4 or 5 hours from there. So it all adds up, but depends on where you start from.
That's a lot of time in the air. Is it expensive to get there?
It's not cheap. No, I mean, you look for bargains and so on. It depends on when you go and all the rest of it. But it was not a cheap flight.
All right, so it takes time, it takes money.
Yes.
What else does it take?
Well, I think it takes a little bit of sense of adventure, but New Zealand is certainly worth the effort. I mean, it is one of the most beautiful places that I've been to, and in addition to the spectacular scenery, it's also one of what I would call the nicest places that I've been to, where everybody was just so friendly and so nice, and there's almost no crime in New Zealand. It's just a wonderful place to visit. So I think it's worth it. Yes, it takes time and money to get there, but I think it's worth the effort.
Tourists are welcomed?
Oh, very welcome, and encouraged, yes.
And if somebody has that on their bucket list to go to New Zealand and they've got the money and the time, what should they plan on trying to do when they get there?
Well, it's a beautiful place, and a lot of it just depends upon the individual and what their interests are. The scenery is fantastic, and they have a great national park system. They have mountains, glaciers. They have a gorgeous coastline, very rugged. Most of New Zealand is comprised of what they call the North and the South Islands, and these two islands are very different. And so again, depending a little bit upon your tastes, you can choose. We actually saw some of both, North and South Islands. And then one of the other things that I think we want to touch on at some point is it's a great place for hiking. So New Zealand, as part of their national park system, has 10 of what they call great walks, which are multi-day guided hikes, and you can do them with a guide where there's lodging, or you can do them in a more rustic manner but they are fantastic multi-day hikes, and they are worth investigating if you like that sort of thing.
Well, knowing you, you took one of the stiffest hikes and took a lot of pictures.
Yes, that's right. We were invited actually by our friends to go do the Milford Track, as it's called, which is a 33-mile. It's a 5-day adventure, but really only 3 serious hiking days. That takes you to the Milford Sound, which is one of the most scenic bays in the entire world, and it's the most popular of the 10 great walks in New Zealand. It was really a great experience for us to do that.
Now you're going along mountainous areas, you're going past bodies of water, and this is inland of these islands.
Right. So this particular hike, and the 10 great walks, there are a variety of different terrains and things that they take you through. This particular 33-mile hike takes you along from a lake. It starts at the head of a lake, along a river to a mountain range, and you then hike over the mountain range and then follow another river out to the sound, and so you come out at the coast. So this is quite spectacular.
How clean is the water?
Well, the water is so clean, and is very interesting. When you do these hikes, you don't have to carry water with you, because you simply dip your flask in the river or the lake and drink directly from that, and they tell you to do that. And they know that a lot of tourists can hesitate to do that, because around here we're not used to that sort of thing. So they show you, they make you try it, dip a cup straight from the lake and drink it. And every night we stopped at a lodge for the evening, and they got their water directly from the lake or river themselves. So they say if you prefer it from the tap, it's the exact same water. So they just, for your convenience, bring it in through the tap.
Well, hold that thought. We have to take our first break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you, this lack of pollution, is it due to no population, no industry, or people caring? We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Environment. I'm George Curtis. My guest is Eric Curtis, Dr. Eric Curtis, a retired engineer from Ford, lives in Detroit area with his wife, Dr. Felicity. And he's here and she's here because they're celebrating Eric's mother's birthday, 87th birthday, Judy DeBrew, and happy birthday to her. And I'm glad he's willing to stop in and talk about one of his favorite subjects and mine, travel throughout the world and how we're taking care of the world. Today's subject is New Zealand, and he describes an area to us where the water's clear, safe to drink, the air is pure, safe to inhale. What kind of industries or people make a living there that they've managed to avoid the pollution we have surrounding us here?
Well, I think it's several things. It is a fairly modest population. I believe all of New Zealand is on the order of 5 million people. So it's not a lot of people. And probably most of those people are in a relatively few number of cities. The main industry, so far as I know, is tourism and raising sheep. So I think sheep outnumber people in New Zealand. But as you had mentioned earlier, I think the people in New Zealand really are passionate about the environment. Everybody that I knew was very outdoorsy. They have a great national park system. They have these great walks that are part of that national park system. And everybody is a hiker. Everybody is really an environmentalist. Everybody, I think, is looking out. I never saw any litter in the more than 2 weeks that we were in New Zealand. I don't think I ever saw a single piece of litter anywhere.
Now, how many of these multiple optional walks did you get to go on?
So Felicity and I just did one of them. There were other things that we wanted to do during our our stay there. We did do several other just short day hikes, but we only did one of these multi-day great walks, which, I mean, it took 5 days, so it was a pretty big chunk of time. Our friends Glenn and Erica went on and did one more up in the mountains that we did not participate in.
Now, these are basically islands.
Well, yeah, I mean, New Zealand it's North and South Island, but these are big islands, right? So these, and they have a lot of tiny little surrounding islands, but New Zealand is North and South Islands are both very substantial islands, yes.
Are there roads along the coast?
Oh yeah, we did a driving trip. We flew into Christchurch and then we drove over the mountain range to the west coast and then down the west coast and back into the interior. And it's a beautiful, rugged coastline. The part that we were on kind of reminded me a bit of the Oregon coast, if you will, at least parts of the Oregon coast. And then after we did this great walk, we went up to the Bay of Islands in the North Island, on the northern edge of the North Island, which is just a gorgeous bay full of islands and full of sailing and boats and fishing and all that sort of thing that you might expect in a big bay like that.
Well, it sounds like a lot of options, and of course the walking reminds me that I've had too many birthdays. What kind of shape do you have to be in to enjoy these walks?
Well, I think there were people that were getting up a little bit in age. I think there was one woman who was late 70s who was doing the walk. She was very fit. She was from Japan. I believe she claimed she had climbed Mount Fuji 5 times. So I don't know. It's so much the age as the conditioning. This particular hike that we did, the first day was 13 miles of flat because it was along the river. The second day was up over a mountain range, and that was hard work. You were going straight up, the first half of the day, and then the second half of the day you were going straight back down, which maybe was harder in part because you were exhausted from going straight up. And then the last day was again another 10, 12 miles of fairly flat. But I will say, I felt like I was in pretty reasonable condition, and it was pretty hard work. I mean, it was a hard 33-mile hike.
But there are some of these walks that people in their 70s or 80s in reasonable shape could bite off and still see some great scenery?
Well, certainly there are. I have not been on all these great hikes, or great walks, but certainly there are many shorter hikes that anybody could do, really, and I think there's a wide variety of these. So the one that we did, like I said, it had that really tough middle day, but we did have this I think she was like 77 years old or something, who did it. So. And
I get the picture that in addition to them being islands, and so you've got ocean water surrounding them, there are inland lakes and waterways as well.
Oh, yes, fantastic inland lakes, and you would have a mountain with a glacier feeding a waterfall to a lake. I mean, it was just some fantastic scenery, and numerous inland lakes, in addition to obviously being surrounded by the.
Well, it sounds like a feast for somebody with a camera, and I know you took a lot of great pictures, and we're going to share them with our audience. We're going to take our second break, and when we come back, my wife would never forgive me if I didn't ask you about the food. I just have a visual, all that fresh water, islands surrounded by salt water. I bet there was some seafood worth discussing. We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Environment. I'm George Curtis. My son Eric Curtis is here, and we're talking about his trip to New Zealand with his wife and a couple of good friends that I know well, and they're world travelers. Yes, they're a little picky as to where they go. And my wife would never forgive me if I didn't ask about the food.
Yeah, well, and the food that we had in New Zealand was fantastic. As you mentioned, obviously being an island, they've got a lot of ocean seafood access. Also, I think the fact that they raise so many sheep, there's a lot of lamb to be had. And luckily, I like both of those, so I enjoyed that very much. And we were joking a little bit about the fact that on this 33-mile hike that we did, and I'll say a few more details about that, but every night we stayed at a lodge where they had a beautiful dinner. And actually the food was so good that on this 33-mile hike, I gained weight on this hike. So I was eating pretty well. A few more details about this hike setup. So basically all you carried with you was a day pack. You really only had the clothes that you wore, a small water bottle that you could fill up along the stream as you went, so you didn't have to carry much weight, and then one change of clothes. And then the way it worked is when you got to the lodge, you would shower, you would put on your clean clothes, the ones that you had worn that day for the hike, you would just wash in the sink with a bar of soap, and then they had a hot room. And you would hang up your clothes in that hot room, and they really counseled us on all having quick dry clothes. So within a couple hours, they would all be dry, just hanging on a line, and they would be ready then to repeat that process. So you really only needed the clothes you wore and one clean pair of clothes and a small water bottle for the whole trip. That's all you needed. So if that makes sense to you, you're just washing every night, but because it's quick dry and they have these hot houses, the clothes are all ready to go the next day and ready to go.
And
So,
when you weren't hiking, you actually got to enjoy some of the coast, and there are roads there and restaurants
That's right.
and reefs and
That's right.
seafood and things like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we did some lovely just sightseeing by car when we first arrived in New Zealand, and mostly driving up and down the west coast of the South Island. And again, just gorgeous, gorgeous scenery. And we did some day hikes, several day hikes as part of that trip, which were just great. And then the last third of the trip, Felicity and I flew up north to Auckland and drove up to the small town of Russell, which is a historic town in New Zealand. It was the first capital, the first permanent European settlement in New Zealand was formed there hundreds of years ago. Captain Cook stopped in at the town of Russell in the Bay of Islands for quite some time. And just this gorgeous bay, huge bay, with people, tourists in their massive yachts. We took a powerboat tour of the bay. We also took a tour on I think a 3 or 4 masted sailboat, which was a great experience to go around the bay. And just gorgeous. So I think all of New Zealand is beautiful, but it's all different, and it's a great opportunity, I think, to see a wide variety of different sorts of landscapes. The other thing I want to mention, though, is the birds. So especially on our hike, the birds are they're different species than what we get here in North America, but the fact that they, at least from my perspective, they had no fear of humans. They would come up and they would perch right on your foot if you just set your foot out. Really an odd experience, actually, with the animals in New Zealand, because they just didn't have the same sort of fear of people that you would expect.
Tell our audience a little bit about what you know about the history of the native people and the influence of European people, if that did indeed take place, whether there was something that would satisfy the greed of the people who move in and like to take control of the wealth. What do you know about the history?
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on the history, but when the European settlers first arrived, or I should say European explorers first arrived, I think around the 1600s, New Zealand was settled, right? So the Maori people were there and thriving and quite happy with life before the Europeans arrived. The Europeans continued to come, and eventually they came up with basically a truce, a settlement, and treaties to get along. And actually, what's interesting in New Zealand is both Maori and English are the two official languages. So they have really, I think, tried to embrace that history, and not tried to erase it at all, but actually embrace it. And it still thrives, right? So especially in the town of Russell, which was where one of the big early treaties was signed. They have a beautiful Maori museum there, and I think that, like I say, that culture is still embraced in New Zealand, which is very interesting.
So as far as you can tell, they're not having racial strife like so much of the world is enjoying.
Yeah, certainly not that I saw. And no, it seems like a coexistence and a real respect, I think, for the indigenous peoples there and their culture, I think is what I saw in New Zealand.
Well, this place is so far from anywhere that it takes money, time, good conditioning to go there, which is why we haven't ruined it yet.
Right. Well, and I think the people of New Zealand really try and take good care of it, right? So I think, as we maybe mentioned earlier before, they're environmentalists, very friendly people, and I think they're very proud of New Zealand, and they really do their best to make sure it stays in its pristine state. So I think they worked very hard at that.
Well, you've been a lot of places in this world. Have you been to any where they've taken better care of the environment than New Zealand?
Not that I can think of. I think that they are justly proud of their place and taking good care of it. And like I mentioned before, they're very outdoorsy people, right? So I think outdoorsy folks generally tend to be environmental people because they're out in it, and they want to make sure it's maintained. So.
Well, Eric, thank you for your insights. I hope you enjoy the birthday party for your mother, and thank you very much for being on the show. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it sounds like a fairy tale. A gorgeous area made up of islands, beautiful highlands, inland lakes, forests, cultural conflicts that don't exist, where the new group appreciates the old group and reveres the history. It's a long way away. It's expensive. But it's an example of people, instead of conflicting, cooperating, respecting each other, their cultures, and their environment. It's a long trip. It's going to cost a lot of money. Start saving now. It's worth the trip. I'm George Curtis, and that's my opinion.